So welcome to today's briefing from the Religion Media Centre, which is on the 2021 census results on religion, which have been published just a few hours ago. And they show that Christianity is below the halfway point for the first time at 46.2%. Non-religion has risen to 37%, and minority religions are increasing in number. And to look at these stats fresh from the press and analyse what they mean, we're joined by a panel, including Professor Linda Woodhead from King's College London, Kathryn Wright from Culham St Gabriel's Trust, Dr. Jasjit Singh from the University of Leeds, Dr. Azim Ahmed from the Islam UK Centre in Cardiff, the Bishop of Burnley, Philip North, and Christopher Jamison, Abbot President of the English Benedictine Congregation. And I know we have lots of others on the call who want to have a say as well. But first of all, could I turn to you, Linda, to start with? These census results have been widely anticipated. And I wonder if you could give us your first reaction, please, as to what they show. Do they shock you? Do they surprise you in any way?
No, I think they're fairly predictable, Ruth, in that we're seeing trends continuing. So as you said, the most important one is the decline in the number identifying as Christian. And let's just remind ourselves, this is a question on the census that asks, what is your religion? So it's a very particular type of question. It's not asking about, do you believe in God? It's not asking, do you belong to religion? It's asking this very broad question about perhaps identification or affiliation. So we're seeing those people who have some reason to kind of feel sympathetic to the word Christian. So the number who identify in that way, say they have a religion and call it Christian, has been steadily declining since the question was first asked on the census in 2001. And, kind of mirroring it is the growth of those who say that they have no religion when they're asked, do you have a religion? Those are the big figures. But we're also seeing Islam growing rather steadily and Hinduism growing rather steadily. So if Ruth, I was to summarize what we're seeing the religious share of the pie is diminishing, but the flavor of that pie is changing.
Can I just pick up the ideas that you told us in a lecture just a couple of months ago on how you see the future of religion in Britain? And you did actually anticipate some of these results here today. You were talking about the way religion is transmitted and how some religions have been more successful than others in that. I wonder if I could ask you just a further question about that. What does this census show you about that? What does it indicate?
It's really worth asking what's driving these figures? How does it actually happen? How do people affiliate or disaffiliate? Of course, one thing that's happening is that the Christian population is quite an aged population. So you're more likely to be Christian if you're an older person, and therefore the death rate affects it. People are simply dying. I had a quick look this morning, and I think I'm right in saying that the decline, however, is larger than the total number of deaths in the population. So it's not just about deaths, it's also about not passing on religion to your children. So clearly that's not happening very effectively in Christianity. It's happening much more effectively in Islam and Hinduism. Passing on to your children is more important than conversion of adults. A final thing to say, Ruth, is that we also have to think about immigration. Immigration has been very high during this period of the last 10 years that we're looking at, and that immigration is mostly Christian. That's would be likely to benefit the most. So that makes it more striking, actually, that Christian has declined so much, and it suggests that there's an even steeper rise than we're seeing in these figures in non-immigrant Christian disaffiliation, in the established born and bred many generations, perhaps, in those children not continuing to follow what their ancestors did.
And just finally, I'm going to ask a short series of questions for all of you. There'll be time for you to jump back in again at the end, Linda. But finally, in your lecture, you spoke about organised religion, you spoke about non-minority religions in this country, and you spoke about non-religion, and you spoke about something else as well, which was the rise of magic. Now, is that encapsulated within the non-religion bracket? And what do you mean by magic?
Yes. So what I'd say overall in this, it's tempting to look at these every time and say, oh, yes, it's evidence of a very broad trend, and we'll call that secularization. But it's just as important to say what we're seeing is increasing diversity, pluralization in the landscape. So more atheists, more agnostics, more variety of religions, and some that aren't really religion at all have often been looked down on as kind of magical or superstitious. But this is actually growing as well. But it doesn't get captured because it's not a category on the census. And some of those people would call themselves religious and some would call themselves non-religious. There is a write-in question, Ruth, so people can write in. They can tick a box that says other, and they can write in. Less than 1% of people do this. It's not a thing that you normally do on a survey unless you're really committed to putting your mark. But in the write-in, the biggest category by far is pagan. And that would be people who do magical practices. And then next is a levy, then fourth comes Wicca, which is another form of magical practice, and the biggest growth of all is in another category called shamanism. So again, we are seeing this increasing diversification, including of forms of things that have been previously not quite seen as really truly religious, but are now, I think, because there's less taboo, people can be more overt about those practices.
So in this environment, I think the key question for you, Linda, is now define religion. What is religion?
Well, I mean, you don't have to do it to understand the census because people are doing it for themselves. And what's interesting is what the really important point is that it's becoming a category that people less want to identify with. But Ruth, remember, the census question doesn't ask you, are you religious? It asks what's your religion? So it breaks them down. The only place it sort of appears is in non-religion. This is complicated because if religion is a sort of toxic word, some people remain, they pray, they do spiritual things, but they would still call themselves non-religious because they're identifying the word religion with institutional religion. That might be a very common understanding of how to define religion, but the census doesn't let us see exactly what people mean by that word. It just shows that quite a lot of people want to not use that word and be identified as non-religious.
Thank you, Linda, and I'm sure we'll come back to you later on. But can I turn now to another member of the panel, Philip North, the Bishop of Burnley. So some quite startling figures there on how people affiliate to Christianity and a decline of, I think, 13% since 2011. Perhaps I think the obvious question is, are you disappointed at that result?
I'm fascinated by it. We're seeing this phenomenon where globally the church is expanding so vigorously, but we've got this pocket in Northwest Europe of growing secularism. I'm not surprised. It saddens me. It saddens me not because of the impact on the institutional church, which in many ways is boring. It saddens me because I want people to know the excitement and the joy of life in Jesus Christ and the life that brings. That's where the sadness comes from. I think a couple of things it makes me think about. First of all, the enduring presence of the church in an increasingly secular nation. What other organisation, as the Church of England does, employs 8,000 people, no charge to the taxpayer, wanting the common good of every community, schools, youth and children's work, 35,000 community projects. It just shows the importance of that going on as kind of modelling generous, hospitable, outward-looking Christian life. It also reminds me that actually our ultimate call as Christians is not to be popular, it's to be faithful. So of course it saddens me, but it doesn't depress me, I think.
What justification is there, though, for example, for bishops in the Lords and church schools remaining if fewer than half of the population affiliate to Christianity?
I mean, church schools is easy in many ways because it's much more complex understanding the religious profile of the nation than one tick in a box in a census. Even analysing that non-religion box is very interesting. Indications that half the people who took that box actually believe in God. And one thing that's very clear is that people want values-based education where faith plays a role. So in this diocese, we have 190 church schools, which are almost all oversubscribed. It remains a very popular thing. Parents want a church impact in education. In terms of bishops in the House of Lords, in some ways, I think it's almost a model for the future. They bring regional representation, they have a retirement date, they're non-partisan, they bring an extra dimension, speaking not just for the church, but for faith generally. And faith remains a very important part of what it means to be human, what it means to be a global citizen. So I think that voice is still a precious and valuable one, as long as the House of Lords exists.
Can I ask you how you think the church has failed in its mission to have got to this stage?
It's a very interesting question, because it's very easy for Christians to feel very depressed, as if it's their fault. I think what we're dealing with is an enormously complex cultural phenomenon that nobody really understands. And, obviously the church has made mistakes. You look particularly at things around child abuse and so on, and places where we've not been seen to be standing up and living out what we believe. And those are egregious mistakes. But at the same time, the country is full of very faithful, hardworking Christians, beavering away, serving their communities, saying their prayers. I want to applaud what they do, and their job is to go on being faithful. It's more complicated than saying the church has got something wrong. This phenomenon is bigger and broader than that. And the fact the church is globally expanding so fast, I think, is evidence of that.
Thank you. And moving to Abbot President Christopher Jamison, the same kind of questions, really. Is it the scandals that have affected the church in recent years that have led to this lack of affiliation with Christianity?
Well, given that it's the continuation of a trend, as Linda has already said, it's clearly not only the abuse scandals, which, as Bishop Philip said, are utterly disgraceful and undermine our credibility, but the decline began way before that. In fact, I think the decline really began at the end of the 19th century for all sorts of historic reasons, when our society started to break up into urban patterns that the church was slow to respond to. So I'm not surprised. As a British citizen, I'm delighted to live in a country where freedom of worship is so clearly evidenced by the facts we see in this census. It's fascinating to delve into your local neighborhood even, but street by street almost, to see the religious diversity in our country. And I think that's really to be welcomed, that we're seeing that freedom of worship, which, as we know, we can't take for granted. As a Christian like Bishop Philip, I'm disappointed, but I think as a Catholic priest, it confirms my view that we have to change very significantly the way we are present in Britain today. And I think the challenges for our direction are many, and I think that how we organize ourselves and the attitude we bring. I'm fascinated that the young Pope Benedict Joseph Ratzinger once said in print that the church's approach had been too hierarchical in the past, which, coming from him, is a surprising statement, and that it needed to have much more confidence in its message beyond the purely hierarchical. And he took the story of the woman who reached out to touch the hem of the cloak of Jesus as an example where the church can offer something to those who just want a touch of something. And that's the category I called I'm spiritual but not religious, which is the category that I want to reach out to and do through, in various ways, reach out to and find I get a very positive response of presenting elements of the Christian tradition, which people find enriching without saying they want to join the church. And as Pope Benedict said, that's an approach which is perfectly fine, and indeed probably going to be one of our principal roles.
Okay, so a further question to you then. So when you, because we're dealing with stories about Christianity all the time, and you see the title Christian put to people who are against same-sex marriage, against women's equality, against so many things that are now accepted in our society today. And the title is also used of people with fundamentalist views, believing in miracles, first century ideas about Jesus. Is that why people just don't want to have anything to do with it anymore? It's irrelevant and it's outdated.
Yeah, I think Dr. Lee has categorized, Lois Lee has categorized attitudes to unbelief very helpfully into an absence of belief, the presence of alternative beliefs, and a sense of the irrelevance of religious belief. And I think there are significant numbers who think that religion is irrelevant. But again, if all faiths, not just Christianity, all faiths sometimes manage to touch people there who are in that, very often the ones who think it's irrelevant would still say they're spiritual. And they manage to bring an element of the spiritual tradition of that religion to a person. And they're surprised to find it's not irrelevant. A Daily Express reviewer once said of one of my books, who would have, what can the abbot of a 5th century religious order have to tell us about happiness? And she then said, it appears quite a lot. So I think there can be that kind of surprising result if we find ways. But I do think the church, these statistics should wake up all religious communities. I think the Muslim and Hindu communities are clearly growing in many ways, but I think they're going to be subject to the same pressures we all are in a diverse and secularized society. We have to find new ways of reaching out to touch that spiritual sense that everybody retains and not see this as just a recruitment exercise. So the danger is we'll interpret these statistics as a call to a bigger recruitment exercise. I think it's a call to a different and imaginative way of offering religious faith and elements of that faith to a spiritual nation.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Lois Lee, by the way, everybody is stuck on a train, so I'm not sure that we're going to get to Lois, but there'll be lots of other people I can see on the screen with ideas about unbelief that we'll come to. Can I go next to Dr. Jasjit Singh, Associate Professor at the University of Leeds? And the stats for what are in the UK minority faiths were quite interesting as well, all showing increases. What do you make of the stats relating to the Sikh Foundation and your own tradition and minority faiths in general? What do they tell you?
So kind of as expected, Ruth, I didn't expect huge increases. So we saw 100k increase in the population, the Sikh population in Britain from 423k to 524 for some of the reasons that have already been mentioned. So migration, I think post-Brexit migration, particularly from Italy and Spain before the end of freedom of movement, contributes to some of that increase. For those that don't know, most of your Parmesan cheese is made by Sikhs in Italy. And also, I think certainly the efforts of young Sikhs in Britain to propagate or inform other Sikhs of the tradition in new and exciting ways via the online environment has made many young Sikhs strongly identified to their tradition. So initiatives by Sikh organizations, in particular by young Sikhs, and more teaching in English has probably meant that more young Sikhs themselves have identified as Sikhs. There was also various census campaigns by Sikh organizations encouraging Sikhs to, identify as Sikh in the religion tick box. So two factors there. I also looked at the language data that was released this morning. And that actually shows more people speaking Punjabi, which I found quite surprising too, which again indicates that it's something I found in my research, that young people are looking to engage more authentically with their tradition. So I found lots of young Sikhs actually wanting to learn Punjabi so they could then read the Guru Granth Sahib in its original rather than through translation. So two key factors then, I suppose. One is the post-Brexit migration, and second is the more Sikhs actually identifying strongly as Sikh. I also saw one last thing. I saw in the analysing postcode data, there's been some movement from traditional migratory areas to other parts of the suburbs. So, for instance, Southall used to be a Sikh stronghold, but that seems to have kind of lost its status to Slough. And similarly with Leeds and Bradford, the Sikh population in Bradford's gone down, but the Sikh population in Leeds has gone up. So you've seen quite a bit of movement from various areas to other areas too.
Thank you. Another question to you, Jasjit. How will the Sikh community use these statistics? And what use is the census in terms of advocating for public policy, for example?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So the website which I've been on this morning is great in terms of its breakdown. You can actually get a geographical breakdown of every tradition by postcode. So it's a clear picture as to which resources would be required in which areas. So for instance, in Leeds, there's a Sikh Elders Association, which caters specifically for Sikh elders, tackles issues regarding loneliness and health issues too. So in terms of actually seeing where institutions can help particular organizations and particular demographics, I think the census and the way it's been presented in this case is really, really helpful.
Thanks very much, Jasjit. And I think we've got Dr. Azim Ahmed on the call. Finding you to speak to us, Azim. So Azim joins us from Cardiff, Deputy Head of the Islam UK Centre and Assistant Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Wales. So Azim, we have a rise in the number of Muslims and obviously a proportionate rise in the percentage of the population. Was it as high as you expected? It seems quite a gradual increase.
We had some estimates coming out from the annual population survey and also independent polling that did put the number of Muslims in the UK at around this figure. So what we know now is there are 3.9 million Muslims in the UK. That's compared to 2.7 in 2011. So actually, in terms of those numbers, they're pretty good estimates we had initially. So the census has confirmed that level of growth. It is quite substantial. It's a reasonable, healthy growth. And I think, in a way it reflects, as Linda mentioned earlier, kind of continuing demographic patterns. So, simply just judging from my own kind of colleagues and peers who are Muslim, we've all been having kids over the last decade. I have more birthday parties to keep track of than I can manage. So I think it's that natural, actually, maturing of the population. 2011 census, I think something like 40% or 50% of Muslims were under the age of 25. So yeah, I think a lot of that growth is related actually to those individuals having families.
We should say that Scotland's census is, I think, released. Northern Ireland about to be. So these figures for England and Wales only, yeah. And so it's the number of Muslims is now 3.9 million, whereas in 2011 it was 2.7 million. Linda made a point in the lecture, which was, as we referred to earlier, that other faiths are very good at passing on their religious tradition. And I think, Linda, I don't think I'm misquoting you, you talked about there being Muslim rappers and there was a vibrant young people scene in Islam. What lessons do you think the Muslims in England and Wales can give to the other faith groups about how the faith is transferred?
Well, there's been some really robust research on this. There's some very useful research by Professor Sophie Gilliard-Ray, who's director of the centre I'm based at, and Jonathan Schofield from Cardiff University, who looked at religious transmission. And it's been built on by other academics subsequently as well. In terms of lessons learned, I think that's going to be a challenging one to answer. But I do think, obviously, parents have a big role to play. It's not always an answer of going to faith schools or similar, but there is a real strong emphasis parents put on children having religious education, and that can sometimes take priority over any other form of education, such as learning the language that the parents speak. But I think comparatively as well, I think you picked up on this. There's kind of, in the census results overall, we're seeing these kind of religious metropolis merging, So Birmingham, Leicester, London, these are incredibly religiously diverse cities. They're quite young and vibrant, like you said. But in these cities, religion is very much part of the equation. Not just Islam, but Christianity, as well as Hinduism, Sikhism, and other minority religions. And so it's a very vibrant religious space. And I think for children who are raised in these cities, there's a very different experience than, say, if you compare to some of the parts of South Wales where religious affiliation is incredibly low. So I think we are seeing this kind of, these cities being an important part of that picture.
Thank you. Thanks, Azim. And I'm going to turn to Dr. Kathryn Wright next. And before I do, just say to everybody, if you've got a question, if you're a journalist on the call, you have a question, please put it in the chat box so that we can have a discussion after we go to our last panelist, Kathryn. Thank you very much for joining us. Kathryn, these statistics presumably will be very interesting to the teachers of religious education in schools. What lessons do you draw from what they've found?
Yeah, I think it's like a special holiday, isn't it, really, today, like a festival day for RE teachers in schools. I've been looking at Twitter and everyone's talking about it. Well, first of all, what a great set of data to be able to explore with young people. I mean, you know, absolutely fascinating, not just the changes, but just the nature of the makeup of our society today. And I think there's a couple of things that really strike me about it. And just going back to Linda's point earlier about the changing nature of the pie. One of the things it reminded me of as Linda was speaking was in the Ofsted Research Review last year. One of the phrases that's used there is helping children and young people to navigate a multi-religious, multi-secular world. And I think that this census confirms that. And so therefore, what we need to be doing, I think, is ensuring that children and young people get a really rich religious education in schools to help them navigate this, what seems to be increasingly complex and diverse society, and being able to engage with that and being able to engage in a well-informed, open and respectful way, I think, as well.
You have a campaign going, and there's a movement to create a change of the name of religious education in schools to religion and worldviews. Does this help you in your campaign?
It's a really good question, Ruth. I think it is partly about a name change, but actually it's much more than that. The idea is really about an approach. So an approach to the subject of religious education, which we're calling, if you like, religion and worldviews, but you could still call it religious education and yet still use this new approach. And the idea of the approach is to think very much about the fact that everyone has a position that they are coming from when they are approaching whatever material it is that you're looking at in the classroom. And we're using the word worldview particularly to sort of think about that, because and I think the census does help in many ways, because I think it shows that people's worldviews are complex. We know from what other people have already said on this call that the definition of kind of being a non or a non-religious person can mean many, many different things. You might still believe in God and be non-religious. You might be an atheist and be non-religious. You might be agnostic and be non-religious. You might actually belong to a particular, what we might traditionally call religious kind of institution, if you like, but still call yourself non-religious. So I think what the approach, a religion and worldviews approach does is to actually begin to navigate that complexity much more deeply.
Controversial question. Do you think that teachers of RE and the way that religious education perhaps is treated in the curriculum at school, with a number of schools not abiding by the rules and timetabling it, do you think that attitude towards religion has borne this fruit, that it's produced children who aren't bothered about religion?
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, I don't have any evidence either way, to be honest. But I don't think that's what religious education in schools is about. I think it's about children being able to understand different religious and non-religious worldviews, and then being able to navigate the space once they've grown up and so on, and go into the workplace. So I don't think it's had necessarily an impact on the stats that are kind of put in front of us. And if I can just sort of add as well, next week, my organisation, Culham St Gabriel's, we're going to be sharing some survey data from a new commission survey through Savanta, which was a national representative sample of parents, so 2,000 parents, and in that survey, I'll give you a few headlines just to sort of put into the mix today. That showed that actually 4 out of 5 parents are talking about questions of religion and belief and so on, and that actually in schools, that's the most important place for children to be able to get accurate and important and useful information about religion and belief. So I think probably the answer is no, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. Just encouraging the journalists to put your questions in the chat box. We're going to go first to Janet Berry. who has a question for you, Linda.
I've got a question that has also already been raised in the chat box about the census question itself. There's been a lot of discussion around the question and about how the question is providing particular answers. But would you want to see any changes in this question? What question would you want to ask in the next census?
I rather suspect there won't be another census at all. That's quite likely because data's coming from other. I'm sad, but I think it probably will be the case. So we probably won't have to worry about this. There are other ways. Somebody's put in the chat the two-step BSA one, where you first ask, do you have a religion, or do you consider yourself belonging, and then you ask, what is it? But different questions get at different things, and it's good to keep. If it ever did have another census, I quite like time series. You can make a comparison, and questions get their own lives. In a way, people campaign around them. People tell you to write in something to represent your community. That's happened with the census, actually. So I think it's got a sort of distinct usefulness, and we can compare. The minute you change any element of the question, you can't compare with previous years before. So on balance, I'd say let's stick with it, and we can complement it with the other more nuanced questions that there are around. The Scottish census asks it a bit differently already.
Okay, I've got a question just to put in while we wait for some more to come in. So Tom Holland gave a lecture with the Theos think tank recently. He was talking about humanism, but he said to live in a Western country is to live in a society that has been utterly transformed by Christian concepts. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has come to be forgotten from view. In other words, we're living in a Christian country, but no one knows it or thinks about it or discusses it anymore. Do you agree with that?
It's a completely fascinating issue. I think 2,000 years in which the Christian faith has utterly absorbed every aspect of culture. It profoundly affects our thinking, our values, our starting point, and I think that's a completely fair point. And the whole business of religious identity is what does it mean when people are or are not ticking a box to say they're Christians? Because part of me thinks, are people just being a bit more honest? And what you might call nominal Christianity is disappearing, which some Christians would say is a good thing, that people are making clearer decisions. Or does this nominal Christianity actually provide a kind of space in which Christians can reach out and serve and proclaim? I think that point is completely correct about Tom Holland. Whether that's weakening, I think it's just impossible to say from something so bland as a tick box and a census, really.
I'm always intrigued as to what people mean by a Christian country. It can mean that a state imposes Christianity in a way that some faith communities impose their faith in Afghanistan, for example. Or it can mean that people share Christian values in a nondescript way, as Tom Holland is saying. So I don't think it's helpful to have a debate around the question, is Britain a Christian country? I think the real insight of this survey is that it is, first of all, a religiously diverse community. And I think we can celebrate that, as I said, as a wonderful example of freedom of worship here. But I think the deeper question is, what do people mean when they say I'm spiritual but not religious? I'd be a rich person if I had £1 for every person who, when they see my Roman collar, look at me and say, "Oh, Father, I was brought up Catholic, but I don't go to church anymore, but I am very spiritual." They always put in the word "very" for some reason. And I usually throw them slightly by saying, well, actually, I'm religious, but I don't know if I'm very spiritual. And you then have a good discussion about what those mean. But there is a persistence, and I'd love to know, what Linda can tell us and others, Kathryn and others, about the research around it. I know there's been a lot of research around that. And I do feel we have to take note of that very large number of people who would say that, and what all the faith communities can do to foster their spirituality. Because if we lose a sense of the spiritual and the transcendent, then I think we really are in trouble. And that's where I would want to take issue with some of the new atheists and some of the humanists who don't see a role for religion to feed our sense of the transcendent and the spiritual.
We usually have representatives of Humanist UK on the call. I don't know if they're with us today, the large number of people here. Just picking up a question from Eddie, the numbers of people saying they're Christian in Northern Ireland and Scotland. So I think I may have got this round the wrong way the last time, but I have in my hand a document that the 2021 census in Northern Ireland has come out, and the proportion of no religion is higher, 17.4%, marked increase from 10.1%. And then the number of religious groups ranges from Catholic 42.3% to Presbyterian 16.6%, Church of Ireland 11.5%. And then for Scotland, I think the results are due out in 2023. I think that was the answer to that. So there's another question in the call here from Christopher Lamb. It could be argued that Christianity was never established to become the dominant social force or a state religion. Don't these census figures show that the church today, which is a minority in many parts of the world, is going to be closer to the early Christian period? Christianity is now a choice rather than a cultural inheritance. As Karl Rahner, the Jesuit theologian, wrote, the Christian of the future will be a mystic, will cease to exist. Who wants to come back on that?
I think that's a very interesting point. I've been putting my hand up to say this for a minute. What we're finding in Lancashire is that where churches are imaginative in the way they're serving communities, when they're imaginative about when they're holding worship, when they're creating places of belonging and service, they're seeing growth. And in many places, are seeing quite interesting growth. And it's not just the evangelical churches, it's across the board where there's flexibility and agility in ways of serving. I'm seeing, for example, in some of our social housing estates, quite beautiful, precious new Christian congregations growing. And many clergy are saying there's an openness to the things of faith. I wonder if one thing this census shows is a kind of questioning. That rather than unthinking, we tick the Christian box because that's part of our national cultural identity. Actually, faith is something that people are thinking about, which is what's creating these opportunities for conversation in local communities. I think that rather ties in with what Christopher Lamb is asking.
It just struck me that again, this is such a great opportunity for this to be explored in schools. So one of the things this religion and worldviews approach thinks about is particularly about change over time, change in context, but also that historical tradition as well. So all of that is brought into the religious education classroom, which surely one would hope would lead to young people that are really going to understand some of this change in complexity that is actually occurring right now. And so actually it makes it a really exciting subject. It's really vibrant. I think one of the really exciting things about this data is it's really vibrant data. And sometimes data can look really flat, but actually when I looked at it first this morning, I thought, gosh, this is really exciting stuff that can be looked at. So I think kind of getting into that with young people will be really good.
Yes, we do know there has been research on what people mean when they tick Christian on the census. Abby Day did a lot of research on that, and they mean things like, and they have different meanings, but they include, I was baptized, my parents were Christian, I go to church occasionally, I identify with Christian values. And everyone who's spoken is absolutely right that those things are less, we see religion now as more of a choice. So those things which were a bit more passive, they were just part of the social atmosphere and what you inherited. That's becoming much less the norm for how you are religious. And if you are religious, you make an identity choice now. And the internet accelerates that as well. And the fact that you have to explain to people why you are and what it is, and you're more likely to get into those conversations because it's not the social norm to be Christian anymore. It is still the norm to be religious, the census is showing us, but not to be Christian. So I think people are right that there's a different way of holding the religion than the past, when it was just much more part of the fabric of social life.
I agree with what Linda's saying, but I was really interested in what Azim said, that within the Muslim community, the passing on of faith between generations seems very strong. And if the current data is showing that, I think that's a very interesting fact for all faith communities to look at and to understand. I just wonder whether that might be a phase that Islam is going through and that might change. I don't know if someone has a view about that, Azim or others. I just think it's a really interesting comment.
And just to echo his great point about cities being a really important context for minority religions to flourish in as well.
And that has been also the experience of the Catholic community as a minority in the 20th century. Grew very strongly in cities, but hardly at all in the countryside, except where there were traditions of so-called recusant Catholics who never changed historically. But I just think this question of transmission versus what Islam is saying about an adult choice, I think within the Christian community, it is increasing an adult choice for a minority. But I think it then raises the question that I'm sure humanists and others will ask as well about the role of religious faith schools and so on. And I think there's a very important discussion to be had around that.
So Jeremy Riddell from Humanist UK is on the call. Jeremy, do you want to come in at that point?
Yes, I mean, I think what's interesting about this, obviously, the faith school debate will go on and on. And from our point of view, clearly the important thing is that people are free to choose and are informed, as Kathryn said, to choose. And I would agree completely with what Christopher Jamison said about the fact that what this illustrates is that we've got freedom of religion and belief, and people are exercising that freedom in numerous different ways. I do think, though, that it's a big stretch for Philip to bang the drum on the Church of England. This is just more evidence of the ongoing decline in the Church of England, and there's no getting around that. And what we're moving into is a new plural phase. And I think one of the things that comes out of that, and maybe Linda would want to comment on this, is whether this whole category of religion and identity, as opposed to values, is the one we should be spending all our time focusing on.
I don't deny the reality of decline. I think I expressed my sadness about that. At the same time, I would not want for a second to undermine the energy of the church in local communities, where we're still, clergy still beavering away in parishes, churches still serving, still being generous, 35,000 social projects, huge community impact. I think that still needs to be celebrated. I don't deny the relative decline, though there's also examples of churches growing vibrantly, but the church still has a great deal to contribute to national life and a great deal to do in terms of the building up of local communities in a way that I would say is almost unique.
Thank you. Jonathan Romain, can I bring you in?
Yes, just to give a Jewish perspective, one of the things that has kept us going, and obviously we're even more of a minority, I think it's 0.5% of the population, is culture and education. And just to unpack that for a second, one of the strengths of Judaism, and we have weaknesses as well, is it's very much a domestic faith. And therefore about 50% of the faith is actually celebrated at home. And don't tell my congregants this, but you can almost be a good Jew and never go to synagogue in your life. And that means that we've got this advantage that, it's very ingrained in children right from the beginning. And the other thing is education. And it's very noticeable at my synagogue, which I don't think is untypical. Virtually all the parents bring their children to Sunday school. They don't ever take them to services. It's extraordinary. They're very much into the education. They want their children to be a good Jew, even if they're not themselves a good Jew. So, and without that enormous desire to pass on that heritage, we'd be sunk.
Thank you. Azim.
To answer that question about sort of, will Muslims become secularized? I think this has been a question that's been asked quite a few times over the last few decades. And Linda has a fantastic work, journal article, which is quite accessible, called Concepts of Religion. And I think one of the things that is quite important to understand is that before Muslims become secularized in Britain, they would need to completely change the way they conceptualize religion. To be secularized is to have a particular idea of what religion is and where it fits. And between some Christians, not all, of course, and say the humanist or the atheist, they actually share a very similar idea of religion, which allows that shift, I think, to take place much more easily. Whereas for minority religions, they're coming in with a much different idea of what religion is in the first place, going back to some of the things Kathryn was saying about worldviews. that means I think there's a bigger distance to cover, and it's not necessarily by any means inevitable that that's going to be the destination. But of course, we'll have to wait and see. And the only thing to add, I mean, Sophie's added the book on religious nurture amongst Muslims, and I think that's really valuable. And from my own research, we just looked at mosques. I mean, in a single lifetime, we've gone from about a dozen mosques in the UK to over 2,000. And one of the primary motivating factors for mosques is the socialization and education of Muslim children, so that they are raised with an ability to practice the religion. So I think in any equation as well, there is this link between places of worship, the attendance of them, and that next generation. And I think that maybe plays a role in, you know, what we're seeing between cities and other parts of the UK, and also Christianity more widely.
It was quite interesting when it comes to the debate about the use of church buildings as well. If they go, then what happens? Jasjit, sorry to have kept you waiting for so long.
It's fine, Ruth, all good. So I was quite surprised to see a 100k increase in the Sikh population, especially given the low birth rates that were shown in the 2011 census. And I think it's important to recognise that the Sikh identity as not just being a religious identity based on belief, but also a heritage identity too. So I'm thinking in particular, over the past 10 years, you know, around 2014, it was, you know, was 100th anniversary of the First World War. So there were lots of, museum exhibits, for instance, about Sikh soldiers fighting for the British, and lots about the Sikh identity beyond, outside the kind of religious sphere as such. So it's important to recognize that when people tick this box, they might not just be ticking it for religious reasons, but also because of their heritage reasons too.
Thank you. And I see Andrew Rogers, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Andrew Rogers from the University of Roehampton. It's a question to pick up on what Linda was saying about migration mostly being Christian, and yet that hasn't offsetted the decline. I'm just thinking about how the decline figures can mask growth in certain Christian sectors, particularly, for example, work I've done on Black majority churches. At the last census, African Christians grew by over 100%. I wondered what, Linda, you were thinking in terms of this ethnic minority groups within the Christian sector, and what you might think would be happening. Although, of course, I know we don't get the multivariate analysis till next year, but what would your sort of prediction be?
Well, you're making a really important point that, of course, there's not decline equally across the board in the Christian sector, let's call it, and that some churches have been growing. And you mentioned Black Pentecostal churches as an example. And we can all point to a particular church that's been growing. But the important point is that growth has not been enough to make any difference to the overall decline. So it looks startling, and it often gets a lot of journalistic coverage because here's a really vibrant thing, but in the big pool, it's a drop. It's a drop that's not been big enough to impact the figures.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. There was a question in the chat box from Kathryn Pepinster. Kathryn, would you like to open your mic and ask the question yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Ruth. I was really thinking about some of the points that are similar to Philip North's about the vibrancy and the energy of some churches. But as numbers of Christians decrease, will we in fact see a decline in those kinds of tremendous means of service that they do to their local communities, because there just won't be the people to continue providing all that kind of work, whether it's food banks or providing groups for the elderly or groups for toddlers or whatever, and spiritual help to people, because eventually the provision of services will catch up with the decline, and there just won't be the people to do them, and also not the people around to fund the buildings. That's the anxiety I think I have about it.
I think that's an extremely good point. I mean, when I was working in urban areas 20 years ago, what churches were doing was basically culture enhancement. What we're doing on estates and urban areas now is emergency first aid. In post-austerity Britain, it's the churches are literally keeping people alive. I could take you to families who've been in desperate straits, where not for the emergency first aid the churches are offering in urban areas, doing so on an increasingly small volunteer base. And where in some places urban churches are under pressure from their sponsoring denominations because they're allegedly not financially viable. And this, I now get really worried about recruiting clergy to some of our urban areas, because if they don't continue the social outreach, there's going to be real problems and real hunger. So Kathryn Pepinster puts her finger on a really important point, and it's certainly one that concerns me. And Christopher, presumably you concur?
Yes, Kathryn and Philip both raised really important points there. I think this, to me, is part of what I meant when I said we have to change the way that we structure our church. The Church of England has always been exemplary in its integration into local communities. I think historically it missed out on certain urban communities, but where it is present, it's very good at being the church of the town, as opposed to the Catholic parish priest, who's tended to be the parish priest of the Catholic community. And I think that there's a lesson here for all religious faiths. We have to somehow show that we are part of the local community and a necessary part of that local community because of the service we offer of body and soul. And I think the body and soul is the important part. And you get some parts of faith communities that concentrate on the body and others who concentrate on the soul. I think that the challenge is how to do both creatively. But I think he's absolutely right. In other words, we would miss the church if it disappeared. I think one of the real challenges, though, especially for the Church of England, more so than for Catholics, is what to do with these magnificent heritage buildings when there are so few people who attend them. And I know it's a live issue for the Church of England. And these figures will, I'm sure, fuel that debate even more.
And so why is it that this kind of incredible work that different churches do doesn't capture the imagination of younger people? Why aren't more of them enraptured by it and want to be part of it?
Well, because I think my basic understanding of the culture of young, which of course you have to be very careful as an old person commenting on that, but that they don't want to belong to anything. So if we had statistics in the decline of membership of trade unions and membership of political parties, we'd find that membership of the Conservative Party had declined even more in recent decades than the decline of churches. People don't join anymore. They will join online groups and they will join for one-off events. But a permanent engagement with any institution is not part of contemporary culture. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges for all of us. How do we overcome this engagement phobia, which I think is a key issue for our culture generally and for our politics?
Thank you. The Bishop has got to leave now. Thank you very much for joining us, Philip. And I think actually we've come to the end of the hour anyway, which was the allotted time. We've several questions there we couldn't get to. One from Laura Marks about Orthodox versus progressive and how that's reflected in all the different faiths. But perhaps that's worth another Zoom, Laura, on another day. And then a really interesting question at the end. I don't exactly know what it means, but does Britain need another story, from Hilal? Again, another Zoom on that for another day. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and do keep in touch with us and our work.